Hi there, I'm Patch, and you'll be reading with me today. Today we're going to be reading Night Shift by Stephen King. Did you know that Night Shift is actually a series of short stories? Is everybody ready? Great! Now, let's settle down, grab some cocoa, and let's begin. The rest of the way trying to persuade myself that I had indeed caught poison ivy somehow. But in the back of my mind, there was another ugly thought. I had an aunt back in my childhood who lived the last 10 years of her life closed off from the world in an upstairs room. My mother took her meals up, and her name was a forbidden topic. I found out later that she had Hansen's disease, leprosy. When I got home, I called Dr. Flanders on the mainland. I got his answering service instead. Dr. Flanders was on a fishing cruise, but if it was urgent, Dr. Ballinger. When will Dr. Flanders be back? Tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Would that? Sure. I hung up slowly, then dialed Richard. I let it ring a dozen times before hanging up. After that, I sat indecisive for a while. The itching had deepened, which seemed to emanate from the flesh itself. I rolled my wheelchair over to the bookcase and pulled down the battered medical encyclopedia that I had had for years. The book was maddeningly vague. It could have been anything, or nothing. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I could hear the old ship's clock ticking on the shelf across the room. There was the high, thin drone of a jet on its way to Miami. There was the soft whisper of my own breath. I was still looking at the book. The realization crept on me, then sank home with a frightening rush. My eyes were closed, but I was still looking at the book. What I was seeing was smeary and monstrous, the distorted fourth-dimensional counterpart of a book, yet unmistakable for all that. And I was not the only one watching. I snapped my eyes open, feeling the constriction of my heart. The sensation subsided a little, but not entirely. I was looking at the book, seeing the print and diagrams with my own eyes. Perfectly normal, everyday experience. And I was also seeing it from a different, lower angle, and seeing it with other eyes. Seeing not a book, but an alien thing. Something of monstrous shape and ominous intent. I raised my hand slowly to my face, catching an eerie vision of my living room turned into a horror house. I screamed. There were eyes peering up at me through splits in the flesh of my fingers. And even as I watched, the flesh was dilating, retreating, as they pushed their mindless way up to the surface. But that was not what made me scream. I had looked into my own face and seen a monster. The dune buggy nosed over the hill, and Richard brought it to a halt next to the porch. The motor gunned and roared choppily. I rolled my wheelchair down the inclined plane to the right of the regular steps, and Richard helped me in. "All right, Arthur," he said. "It's your party. Where to?" I pointed down toward the water where the big dune finally begins to peter out. Richard nodded. The rear wheels spun sand, and we were off. I usually found time to rib Richard about his driving, but I didn't bother tonight. There was too much else to think about, and to feel. They didn't want the dark, and I could feel them straining to see through the bandages, willing me to take them off. The dune buggy bounced and roared through the sand toward the water, seeming to almost take flight from the tops of the small dunes. To the left, the sun was going down in bloody glory. Straight ahead and across the water, the thunderclouds were beating their way toward us. Lightning forked at the water. "Off to your right," I said, "by that lean-to." Richard brought the dune buggy down to a sand-spraying halt beside the rotted remains of the lean-to, reached into the back, and brought out a spade. I winced when I saw it. "Where?" Richard asked expressionlessly. "Right there," I pointed to the place. He got out and walked slowly through the sand to the spot, hesitated for a second, then plunged the shovel into the sand. It seemed that he dug for a very long time. The sand he was throwing back over his shoulder looked damp and moist. The thunderheads were darker, higher, and the water looked angry and implacable again under their shadows and the reflected glow of the sunset. I knew long before he stopped digging that he was not going to find the boy. They had moved him. I hadn't bandaged my hands last night so they could see and act. If they had been able to use me to kill the boy, they could use me to move him, even while I slept. "There's no boy, Arthur." He threw the dirty shovel into the dune buggy and sat tiredly on the seat. The coming storm cast marching, crest-shaped shadows along the sand. The rising breeze rattled sand against the buggy's rusted body. My fingers itched. "They used me to move him," I said dully. "They're getting the upper hand, Richard. They're forcing their doorway open a little at a time. 100 times a day I find myself standing in front of some perfectly familiar object, a spatula, a picture, even a can of beans, with no idea how I got there, holding my hands out, showing it to them, seeing it as they do, as an obscenity, something twisted and grotesque. Arthur," he said, "Arthur, don't. In the failing light, his face was wan with compassion. "Standing in front of something, you said. Moving the boy's body, you said. But you can't walk, Arthur. You're dead from the waist down." I touched the dashboard of the dune buggy. "This is dead too, but when you enter it, you can make it go. You could make it kill. It couldn't stop you even if it wanted to." I could hear my voice rising hysterically. "I am the doorway, can't you understand? They killed the boy, Richard. They moved the body." "I think you'd better see a medical man," he said quietly. "Let's go back. Let's check. Check on the boy then. Find out. You said you didn't even know his name. He must have been from the village. It's a small village. Ask." I talked to Maud Harrington on the phone when I got the dune buggy. If anyone in the state has a longer nose, I've not come across her. I asked if she'd heard of anyone's boy not coming home last night. She said she hadn't. "But he's a local. He has to be." He reached for the ignition switch, but I stopped him. He turned to look at me, and I began to unwrap my hands. From the Gulf, thunder muttered and growled. I didn't go to the doctor, and I didn't call Richard back. I spent 3 weeks with my hands bandaged every time I went out. 3 weeks just blindly hoping it would go away. It wasn't a rational act, I can admit that. If I had been a whole man who didn't need a wheelchair for legs or who had spent a normal life in a normal occupation, I might have gone to Doc Flanders or to Richard. I might still have, if it hadn't been for the memory of my aunt, shunned, virtually a prisoner, being eaten alive by her own failing flesh. So I kept a desperate silence and prayed that I would wake up some morning and find it had been an evil dream. And little by little I felt them. Them. An anonymous intelligence. I never really wondered what they looked like or where they had come from. It was moot. I was their doorway and their window on the world. I got enough feedback from them to feel their revulsion and horror, to know that our world was very different from theirs. Enough feedback to feel their blind hate. But they watched. Their flesh was embedded in my own. I began to realize that they were using me, actually manipulating me. When the boy passed, raising one hand in his usual non-committal salute, I had just about decided to get in touch with Cresswell at his Navy Department number. Richard had been right about one thing. I was certain that whatever had gotten hold of me had done it in deep space or in that weird orbit around Venus. The Navy would study me, but they would not freakify me. I would have to wake up any more into the creaking darkness and stifle a scream as I felt them watching. My hands went out toward the boy, and I realized that I had not bandaged them. I could see the eyes in the dying light, watching silently. They were large, dilated, golden-irised. I had poked one of them against the tip of a pencil once, and had felt excruciating agony slam up my arm. The eye seemed to glare at me with a chained hatred that was worse than physical pain. I did not poke again. And now they were watching the boy. felt my mind sideslip. A moment later, my control was gone. The door was open. I lurched across the sand toward him, legs scissoring nervously. So much driven deadwood. My own eyes seemed to close, and I saw only with those alien eyes. Saw a monstrous alabaster seascape, overtopped with a sky like a great purple way. Saw a leaning, eroded shack that might have been the carcass of some unknown flesh-devouring creature. Saw an abominated creature that moved and respired and carried a device of wood and wire under its arm. A device constructed of geometrically impossible right angles. I wondered what he thought, that wretched unnamed boy with his sieve under his arm, and his pockets bulging with an odd conglomerate of sandy tourist coins. What he thought when he saw me lurching at him like a blind conductor stretching out his hands over a lunatic orchestra. What he thought was the last of the light fell across my hands, red and split and shining with their burden of eyes. What he thought when the hands made that sudden flailing gesture in the air just before his head burst. I know what I thought. I thought I had peeked over the rim of the universe and into the fires of hell itself. And pulled at the bandages and made them into tiny, whipping streamers as I unwrapped them. The clouds had blotted the red remnants of the sunset, and the dunes were dark and shadow-cast. The clouds raced and boiled above us. "You must promise me one thing, Richard," I said, over the rising wind. "You must run if it seems I might try to hurt you. Do you understand that?" Yes. His open-throated shirt whipped and rippled with the wind. His face was set, his own eyes little more than sockets in early dark. The last of the bandages fell away. I looked at Richard, and they looked at Richard. I saw a face I had known for years and come to love. They saw a distorted, living monolith. "You see them?" I said hoarsely. "Now you see them?" He took an involuntary step backward. His face became stained with a sudden unbelieving terror. Lightning slashed out of the sky. Thunder walked in the clouds, and the water had gone as black as the river Styx. Arthur. How hideous he was! How could I have lived near him, spoken with him? He was not a creature, but mute pestilence. He was... "Run! Run, Richard!" And he did run. He ran in huge bounding leaps. He became a scaffold against the looming sky. My hands flew over my head in a screaming orlesque gesture, the fingers reaching to the only familiar thing in this nightmare world, reaching to the clouds. And the clouds answered. There was a huge blue-white streak of lightning that seemed like the end of the world. It struck Richard. It enveloped him. The last thing I remember is the electric stench of ozone and burnt flesh. When I awoke, I was sitting calmly on my porch, looking out toward the big dune. The storm had passed and the air was pleasantly cool. There was a tiny sliver of moon. The sand was virginal. No sign of Richard or of the dune buggy. I looked down at my hands. The eyes were open but glazed. They had exhausted themselves. They dozed. I knew well enough what had to be done. Before the door could be wedged open any further, it had to be locked. Forever. I could already notice the first signs of structural change in the hands themselves. The fingers were beginning to shorten and to change. There was a small hearth in the living room, and in season I had been in the habit of lighting a fire against the damp Florida cold. I lit one now, moving with haste. I had no idea when they might wake up to what I was doing. When it was burning well, I went out back to the kerosene drum and soaked both hands. They came awake immediately, screaming with agony. I didn't make it back to the living room and to the fire, but I did make it. That was all 7 years ago. I'm still here, still watching the rockets take off. There have been more of them lately. This is a space-minded administration. There's even been talk of another series of manned Venus probes. I found out the boy's name. Not that it matters. He was from the village, just as I thought, but his mother had expected him to stay with a friend on the mainland that night, and the alarm was not raised until the following Monday. Richard. Well, everyone thought Richard was an odd duck anyway. They suspected he might have gone back to Maryland or taken up with some woman. As for me, I'm tolerated, although I have quite a reputation for eccentricity myself. After all, how many ex-astronauts regularly write their elected Washington officials with the idea that the space exploration money could be better spent elsewhere? I get along just fine with these hooks. There was terrible pain from the first year or so, but the human body can adjust to almost anything. I shave with them and even tie my own shoelaces. And as you can see, my typing is nice and even. I don't expect to have any trouble putting the shotgun into my mouth or pulling the trigger. Started again 3 weeks ago, you see. There's a perfect circle of 12 golden eyes on my chest.